For those joining, my name is Mark Stoddard. I run sales and marketing here at ClientSuccess. We are a customer success growth platform that helps companies manage their installed base and to grow their companies. And I'm joined today by Megan Macaluso, the VP of Strategic Development at ESG. Megan, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you just fine. Am I coming in clear?
Yep, hear you coming in clear. And can everybody also hear Megan? The same thing that you did to kind of pop into the chat pane that you could hear me. Could you guys hear me okay? Yep, looks like everybody can hear you good. So perfect. Well, we're really excited for you to join our first webinar of 2020. For those of you who have been following this for a while, you'll know that we typically do customer success related webinars, usually a couple a month. And it took us a little bit longer to get started with January, our first one starting at the end of the month, but we are really excited to get started today with Megan Macaluso. And for those of you that have been following client success webinars for a while, you'll notice we're gonna do something a little bit different today. Usually we'll have a pretty heavy kind of content format with multiple different slides and we're presenting different topics. Today with Megan, what we wanted to do is something that's a little bit more fireside chat kind of podcast type format. And so we're gonna talk through a topic that looks like a lot of people are really interested in, and it's gonna be around why customer success should embrace owning revenue. It's a really hot topic in our industry right now. And we hear a lot about it here at Client Success. We hear a lot about it across the industry. So what we thought would be great is to get Megan on, who's been around customer success for as long as anyone can remember, and she can talk through a lot of her experience around it. And so really excited for it. For everyone just to know, just kind of some housekeeping stuff. I will be recording the webinar, so I'll send out the recording afterwards. If you have to drop off early, or if some of your colleagues couldn't join, they'll be able to get the recording afterwards. And we also want this to be really interactive. So I will be doing my best to keep a lively conversation, but also keep an eye on the chat pane. So if there's any key questions that you want to discuss, we'll also keep an eye on time. We're going to try to keep things wrapped up by the bottom of the hour, and we can get through everything there. So Megan, does that work for you? Anything else you wanted to add before we jump in?
No, Mark, just really appreciate the time and have always enjoyed working with people that are on your team and that are part of client success and interested in this really important topic to discuss today.
Awesome. Yeah, we're excited for it. So just so everybody to give a little bit of context into Megan, her background, ESG, so everybody knows kind of where we're coming from. So Megan, as I mentioned a minute ago, she's the VP of Strategic Development at ESG. So ESG, what they do is they partner with clients on their customer success strategies, and then they help execute those strategies by delivering processes, people, technology solutions, thought leadership, consultation, marketing, and digital communication services, all focused around customer success. And so Megan's been in the industry for about 15 years, and she's seen a lot of different diverse angles. And so she has a really cool, unique perspective on today's topic, which is, as you see here on the slide, why customer success should embrace owning revenue. And so Megan, let's kind of start at the top. Maybe if you could help us, since you've been around the industry for a while, give us kind of the background of the industry. Maybe if we were sitting here in January of 2010, what does customer success look like? And then kind of how have things evolved into where we now sit today in January of 2020?
Certainly. So if we rewind all the way back to 2010, I mean, it really was a different world, right? So customer success, I think as a phrase, I don't know that it existed per se. Cloud solutions, software solutions were kind of emerging into the marketplace. And I would say, on-premise solutions were generally still and hardware were the lion's share of kind of the technology offering world.
Sure.
And in my experience, I came from a call center, a cloud-based technology that was very new at the time. And I joke because literally it was like servers sitting in some guy's basement. and that had a really slick interface, and people could log into it. And it was awesome because you could add and remove agents, and you could do all kinds of things without having to buy hardware and hire people to take care of that hardware and take care of those servers and manage all of that telecom stuff, right? Like we could take care of that. And at that point, I had a unique view into what you would now call adoption, because we would bill based on agents' dialing behavior, right? And so every month I could see exactly how many agents were using against how many were bought, and how the solution was really being utilized. And so I didn't realize it at the time, but that was a really fortunate place to be in. And I had an account management title, and I sat under sales. So I had, a variable compensation that went along with my base. I had upsell and cross-sell opportunities, but I largely maintained that trusted advisor type role with my clients. The solution was new, and it wasn't necessarily all that reliable. And it was important that I could be there for my customers and listen to them and help troubleshoot and solve their problems, and that they didn't feel like I was always trying to sell into that space. But at the same time, it was clearly on my plate that their retention and their growth was my responsibility. And it's interesting, fast forwarding 10 years later, is, you can see where customer success had emerged from that corner, but you can also see where CS has emerged from places like professional services, right, or support. And those organizations behave differently, right, because we're all coming from these different areas of the business. And as these companies have transitioned into the SaaS world, that need for that customer success role with customers really evolved from where the highest need was within all of these businesses. So, where we arrive at today is really varied in the marketplace.
Yeah, that's fair. And it sounds like you've even been probably ahead of a lot of the market, and that from kind of day one, it sounds like when you were managing with that call center software, you were still owning a number to a certain degree, it sounds like. Whereas there's a lot of companies we'll talk to that, sometimes even today, they play more of kind of an accelerated maybe support role versus owning a revenue number. So help us understand a little bit like the transition that the industry has made from, maybe more account management type roles, maybe more tier 2, tier 3 tech support type roles, to where we sit today, where in a lot of cases, customer success is really a strategic growth lever department team within the business. How have you seen that evolve over the last 10 years?
One of the key elements, at least in the companies that we've seen and talked to, seems to be how much CS evolved around reactive work versus proactive work, right? And those are words that are used a lot, sure, right? But I mean, a sales organization is generally not a very reactive group, mm-hmm, right? So if you're talking pure sales, that is forward-looking, providing solution, reaching out. And if you have CSMs, and this is very common, right, where a key part of their role is being that reactive relationship contact, in areas where that is heavier, I'd say, those are places where it's harder to assign a number potentially, right? Because if you're dealing with escalations and you're fighting fires all the time, it's not a great place to be successful with growth. Yeah. And also sometimes highly technical individuals. So where customer success, again, like if it emerged more from a professional services place, like sometimes they're more like a TAM or something, or like a technical consult. Mm-hmm. Those are areas where maybe like a number isn't as, hitting a number, owning a number isn't as prevalent. But I think the really important thing here, and if everyone listening only hears one thing over the course of this time, is that customer success has to have some kind of revenue alignment with the organization that owns revenue. So whether that's like a CRO, whether that CS organization is rolling into a CEO, even if you're like underneath an operational place. And that doesn't necessarily mean CSMs need to own a number, right? And I think that's the thing that scares us all around revenue being brought into CS is we want to be those advocates, right? Like we hire people that really care about their customers. We don't want to create necessarily a culture of high pressure sales. But that said, CS's ability to fit underneath and assurance that you can communicate to executive leadership that customer success is impacting and influencing revenue in a mandatory way is really critical in order to succeed and expand. And we can talk about, different ways on how to do that. But that is definitely a key thing that we've seen is why customer success should embrace owning revenue. It's because that's the way that customer success can move forward.
So go a little bit deeper on that first part that you mentioned, where maybe not necessarily in some cases like owning a revenue, owning a quota, but you mentioned something to the effect of they need to align to a revenue number. Like unpack that, maybe like give us a few examples of kind of what you mean there, because that's really interesting.
Sure. So there are different models that we've seen. And of course, there's no one way to do this, right? It's all completely dependent on the structure of the company. If it's a smaller company that's rapidly growing, that's a very different environment than, let's say, an organization that is well established, perhaps that is in, a more like hardware world that is transitioning over, right? So understanding the elements of your business, number one, are really important. Secondly is, if you're saying to yourself, how do I both provide the support and the advocacy to my client that we desire and we know is right, while still having a seat at the table because we're driving revenue, and how to marry those things. There's a couple creative ways that you can go about that, right? So we've been talking to a company recently, as a matter of fact, that's publicly traded, global, and is in the manufacturing space. And they've done something interesting, which is customer success has a number. They have a retention number. They have a growth number, but the CSMs themselves do not have a quota. They know well how to connect the dots between if CSMs are really focused in on having a strong adoption and time to value, if they're really focused in on providing, relationship elements that drive customer health, that they're driving adoption, if they focus in on those areas, that outcome will be revenue, right? And so there isn't a necessity to run a CS team with like a quarterly sales goal, let's say. They're able to allow their team to focus in on the right areas while as an organization still owning a number, which puts them at a huge advantage because they're not seen as a cost center. They're seen as owning and driving a huge revenue number, right? Which gives them a lot more control over what they're able to do in their organization.
What's your sense of how that company evolved to that? Because I suspect they probably didn't arrive at that situation kind of right out of the gate of having frontline CSMs owning an adoption metric and then having the overall team, maybe the VP or the chief customer officer owning a number. What's your sense of how they evolved to that? Or did they come right out of the gate with that idea?
No, it's a nuanced way of looking at it. And it's actually not something that we see very often.
That's for sure.
Generally speaking, it's really weighted one way or the other. But it's, and I don't actually know. I mean, I would assume that it took like, having advocacy from your executives and helping them understand what it is that you need to do and how you need to do it to be successful. And it's really the ability to connect the dots between those early indicators, those leading indicators and that early behavior to a lagging outcome, right? And I think that's really the key of it. And we work with companies a lot in these conversations is how to put those things together. And it's not easy to do. So even if you are an organization that says, hey, look, we've really got our focus on adoption right now, because that's just where we are, right? So long as you are always forward looking to what that revenue impact will be, and how you're helping to reduce cost to serve and improve revenue, you'll stay on the right track. But frankly, in organizations that we've seen where maybe, you know, the focus of a CS leader is purely on adoption, let's say. We've seen really strong, smart CS leaders lose their roles at companies because there isn't a clear line of sight between that adoption and that revenue. So what I would say is just have all of those things in your tool bag. And even if you can't connect the dots yet, understand how to connect those dots.
Gotcha. So kind of going a little bit to the side of this. So this is a really cool, interesting idea of having an organization where the frontline team owns some type of adoption or some type of customer success leading indicator while the overall organization owns a number. That's a really cool idea. Now let's go down the world where I think a lot of people on the call are, where they're more a traditional, the customer success team kind of top to bottom owns a number, whether that's a growth number, whether that's a retention number. I think that's we're getting a lot of questions around that. So oftentimes when we're kind of making this transition, there's a lot of people in the industry that would advise away from having a customer success team own a number because, and you've referred to this a little bit, but I want to kind of call it out specifically, that they've advised people away from that because the more that the customer success team owns a number, there's more likelihood that they manage to the number. They start to make decisions on a monthly, quarterly sales number versus what's going to be in the best interest of the customer. They might do things that would lose their quote unquote trusted advisor status. And that's always the risk around this. And I think that's what creates a lot of kind of tension, confusion, differing opinions on this topic. I'm curious of what you've seen, maybe examples you could share of companies that have gone down this path, have moved to a revenue ownership model within customer success, but at the same time, figured out ways to not lose that trusted advisor status.
Sure. So a couple of things. So for organizations where the solution's relatively complex, right? And a customer success manager has an opportunity with their clients to build the relationships, to really be part of the solutions, really understand their business, right? So when that world really becomes around, I am providing you a solution that you need, and that's what we're working toward, and we trust each other, then it doesn't really feel like selling. And if you hire the right people that are in roles like that, that can work really beautifully, right? And so I think those are areas where some companies have that figured out really well. That is hard to scale, and it's hard to hire people that can kind of live on both sides of that fence. And so kind of alternatives can look like customer success managers perhaps owning the renewal from a revenue standpoint. And if that is run and coached correctly, I mean, what that should look like is if you're really managing the customer life cycle appropriately, the renewal should be an outcome of that versus a sales event, versus a transactional sales event. The other thing we're starting to see more of is a customer success qualified lead, sometimes called a CSQL. And in that regard, because a CSM has better insight into who their customers are, what they need, what their pain points are, where there's the right solution for them, but perhaps they don't want to impact the relationship in a negative way by feeling like they're selling there, then you can take those leads and give them to a salesperson that can kind of own that relationship in that way. So there are a few different ways to slice and dice that that I think work well. We have clients too where there's some sort of variable compensation model that's like a blend of and maybe you're talking a base comp that's in the like 70 to 80%, and then that other 20 to 30% is some mix of customer health and retention. Gotcha. Right? So I think there's a really broad spectrum there of what you can do, really depending on what your solution is and what comprises your team and how much you're trying to scale.
Yeah, and that's fair. I mean, what I like about what you mentioned there is there's still that sliding scale of owning revenue versus owning items that impact revenue. Like that customer success qualified lead, if somebody's held accountable to providing a certain number of those to the sales team, that's another way that they could influence revenue, but not necessarily in all cases have to be the one who's owning, closing, because a lot of that, like you said, depends on the skill set of your business, your company, and the people that you have on the bus. In the sales world, because that's really where I spend a lot of my time is on the sales and marketing side. There's this term of a challenger seller that's really made a big jump in the last 5-10 years. And those people that are on the call that have kind of moved into customer success from a sales org will be familiar with that. And really what that is, the idea of not only in customer success, but even in the sales world, there's a move toward how do we become more trusted advisors? How do we become more strategic consultants, assets to the business? And a lot of that is how do I help my buyers or customers to think about their business in a different way? How do I consult them to think about their challenges and change their paradigm and really educate, in that case, prospects to think differently about their business? Well, the same thing can apply to a CSM who's owning revenue. If they could really own the education is another way that we could think about it. So I see there's a lot of parallels between on the sales world moving toward kind of challenger selling, the same idea around the CSM world. We've got a bunch of questions coming in, and I know we're getting tight on time. I want to just kind of go through a few of these questions, if that's okay with you, Megan.
Absolutely.
So, Chris, I'm going to kind of read a few of these questions, and I might need to clarify a few things. But so Chris writes this question in the Q&A. He says, if your CSM team shares accounts with account executives and both individuals on the account own the revenue, would you urge your company to make a shift to have the account executive removed? And how would you go about doing that? So it's really a question of, and I actually was going to ask this question myself a little bit earlier, of kind of like ownership. And there's, in a lot of cases, I'm going to go a little bit further on Chris's question here. There's a lot of cases where the sales team has traditionally owned revenue, and there's a bit of turf war between sales and customer success and who should own the revenue and kind of what's tied to that. In this case, it looks like Chris has a team where kind of there's almost a team approach where the CSM and the AE own it together. What have you seen work there? Maybe just kind of share us some examples of, do you see the pooled model working really well? If so, what are the things you need to have in place to make that work? Or would you advise to have more of a CS owning the revenue because they own the relationship? What are your thoughts there?
In this circumstance, I think you kind of have to take an outside in view from a customer standpoint, right? So having a bigger team can be good sometimes, and it depends on the number of stakeholders you have, right? Like if you have quote unquote, your customer isn't generally one person, right? And if there is a scenario where you're a customer success manager and there is an account executive, you may have different relationships with different types of stakeholders, right? And so there are certainly circumstances where having that bigger team to be more effective, where you have a CSM that's like, hey, I'm day to day. I know how this onboarding went. I know who's using this stuff. I know who's not. I know how many tickets are calling in all the time. I know, I know all this stuff, right? But I don't necessarily have a tie in to the financial decision makers of this organization. Those are areas where having a bigger team is really valuable and necessary. If you're finding that, when I have this conversation inside of like key account management type circles where everyone's kind of trying to figure out where their place is, and sometimes there's like a CSM, an account manager, and an account executive, right? And then you have support, like there's so many people. Is really take a look at the customer and figure out what they need, and suit to fit that way. Because if you've got two people owning a number, but only one of those people are really doing the work or really required there, you may not need an account executive. So I know that was a lot of ifs, but I think that's the way to approach that scenario is kind of why. Like, why is everyone there? And is that what you should keep doing?
Now for you, is there kind of a customer size implication there? Because I remember I've played this game in the past where prior to ClientSuccess, I was at HubSpot, and there was a point in time where we set up a structure that ultimately led to there could be potentially 4 or 5 people that would be calling into an account. And we ultimately realized that for the size of our customers, I mean, HubSpot was selling to, small and mid-market companies that were spending, $10,000 to $20,000 a year. Ultimately, having 4 to 5 points of contact really was just far too much. And I talked to a friend of mine who at the time was working at Oracle, and it was very common for them to have 4 or 5 different points of contact for different business lines, simply because these were $250,000 to $500,000 accounts. And so having 1 or 2 people actually was not enough. Do you kind of see the same thing, or how would you think about that?
So I think it's like what you were talking about earlier with scaling, right? Like, I think sometimes, and it's easy to do, like companies do things the way, because it's just how they've always done it, right? And so if an install base is growing and changing, and the thing that you've always done doesn't seem to quite lock into that, those are difficult conversations, right? To say, what should we start doing that we haven't done? What should we keep doing? And what should we stop doing, right? Like, and that's a hard question to ask when you have these like legacy groups, and there's things like commission involved, and there's livelihoods at stake here, right? And there's whole organizations that have been around a really long time that all of a sudden may not make sense in the world that we're in now. So those are really tricky situations to be in. But certainly I think we're seeing it a lot, where you've got these like layers of people addressing the market. And since customer success has really emerged as its own practice, often adding an additional layer. And then it's like, well, do we now need still 3 or 4 layers of people reaching into our customer base?
Sure. That makes sense. Switching gears a little bit. So Sean asks the question related to the CSQL model that you mentioned earlier. And so for those who missed that part, that was a model that Megan mentioned where the customer success team doesn't necessarily own a revenue number, but they're responsible for sharing customer CSQLs, customer success qualified leads, to some other team, whether that's an account executive team or some upsell, cross-sell team. So when you see that, Megan, the question here is like, how's the revenue scale structured? Is it, do you see people held accountable to number of referrals? Do you see people held accountable to the amount of revenue impacted off the back of those referrals? So if somebody sends 1 CSQL a month, but turns into a really big upsell, like how do you typically see that working?
We've seen a couple of things. It can just be volume, right? And so much of the value of customer success is that feedback loop, right? That we have this opportunity in the way that we interface with our clients, where, with some of the tools and the ability that we have to really circulate the things that we know about our companies to the organizations that need to have those, right? And so I think, some of our clients have been really referral heavy, right? So like client advocacy is certainly something that can be very effective. And so there's a way to like set some like goals around that. And then, the revenue. So like if a lead comes through and then it closes, right? And sometimes it's like an extra kicker. Like sometimes it's not like there's some expectation of how many of those. It's like, hey, well, there's, X amount of commission that comes to your CS person if they provide a qualified lead, right? It really depends on the way that the organization is structured and how you can pass those things through. But those are really good options And the other thing is, if you're capturing those within some sort of system, you can have data around, hey, like these are the customers that are providing leads, right? Like these are the types of customers we're seeing that are interested in buying more.
Gotcha.
And you can start to understand and be more prescriptive about when and how to approach selling in those environments.
In the world in which you go specific to referrals, so you say, look, you need to provide, a dozen, 2 dozen, whatever the number is. You need to provide a certain number of referrals every month, every quarter to the sales team. How do you control quality? How do you make sure that it's not just, oh, I'm flipping stuff over the fence back to whoever's responsible? What's some advice you have there to make sure that the leads that get passed over in that case are highly qualified?
I don't know that you can avoid working your way through that. I mean, I think the hope is that you have a team you trust, and that there's definition. If you're doing it at scale, I think you wind up in places where you say a qualified lead means these things, right? It has to meet these criteria in order for it to count, quote unquote. So again, like I think scale is such a big part of this whole conversation, right? That if you need to do things at scale, the process part becomes that much more important if you're going to do something a little out of the box like that.
Yeah, and what I find in addition to that is just it's a feedback loop. You don't get it right out of the gate. You set the criteria, you set the system, and then in a lot of cases, it's several months of going back and forth of sharing good examples and making sure those good examples are shared all the way across the business, whether that's in weekly stand-ups, whether that's in all hands meetings, so that everybody knows, here's 10 examples of really good customer success qualified leads that got passed across, and here's what happened with them.
Right.
And then there's the individual kind of manager coaching. So that's a lot of what I think it comes down to. A lot of it comes down to that CSM and their manager really working through that. Very good. I'm going to take 2 more questions here, and I know we're a little bit over on time, but we got a bunch of questions here. Maybe what we'll try to do is answer some of these questions that we don't have time to get to in a follow-up mail. But here's a question from Nathan who asks, he says, I understand assigning quotas for folks coming from sales, but how do you convince CSMs that grew up in support or other areas of the org that aren't used to owning revenue responsibility? So if somebody's never owned a revenue they grew up in support, product, something else. They never really owned a number. Now you're talking about owning revenue. How do you convince those folks? Or can you convince them?
I think it's a great question. The people that I've known that have made that transition really well, it just comes back from really solution and customer oriented people. Because that's what it's about, right? Like really talented support people that I've seen are true advocates for their customers, and really, some of my favorite people that I've ever worked with from the support side when I was in account management or some kind of sales roles were the first ones to raise their hand and say, hey, you know what these guys could use is this thing over here, right? And so part of it is, number one, you're hiring. And, just understanding, if you're going to make that transition with someone that does not have experience owning a number, like what is that going to look like, and do they feel comfortable with it? Number two is be really careful not to just walk into a CS org and slap a number on everybody, right? Like nothing, we give this guidance a lot around, be really careful making that transition, because to your point, there are a lot of people that come from a support world that are super talented customer success managers that are going to feel very uncomfortable with the idea that they're selling into their client. And so there's some transition and coaching and learning and understanding that really needs to take place there. But my view has always been, it should be around, you're finding the right solution for your customer.
Sure.
And so long as that's your focus, that should work.
Gotcha. Very good. Now, we've got time for one more. I'm just going to take this question from Phyllis and read it through, and then kind of we'll wrap up after this. So Phyllis asks, as far as ownership is concerned, some companies and leadership believe that if a CSM is aligned, but not tied directly to a number, then they frankly don't see the value in CSMs. So how do you persuade senior leadership, for lack of a better word, that a CSM is critical to the revenue through maybe an alignment model? So it's kind of that question again of if CSM's not owning, and maybe that's back to the whole premise for this discussion. If they're not directly owning or influencing a revenue number, you're probably going to have this as a challenge. What are your thoughts on that, Megan?
So Kristen Hayer from the Success League talks about this all the time, right? Like, how do you present a business case to executives and board members who don't understand metrics that mean a lot to people like us, right? At the end of the day, there has to be a tie to revenue and growth, and there has to be an understanding of how you're impacting cost. And so and there's no one right answer, but I think that alignment piece is exactly right. So if you're building a customer success organization, figure out quickly how to own part of that number. Again, even if you're influencing it, which you are, right? Like your clients staying with you, and like retention, the revenue that comes with that retention, your impact on things like churn, right? Like there's math behind that. And so it's really all about, and I would say too, like understand what your CFO cares about. So do that homework to say, like, what are they looking at? How are they thinking about this? How educated is my executive group about what customer success does? And then how do I make sure to connect those dots for them so it is very clear the value that we're driving? And I think that's how really good CS leaders can get to a place where they're like, I'm not giving my CSMs a quota,
sure,
but we are driving positive growth for this company, and there's a lot of question about it. So really understand what the financial stakeholders are looking at, and learn how to speak their language with what it is that you're doing. Because if you show up to many CFOs and you start talking about customer health or adoption, no idea. So it's important to know the financial impact of what it is that we're doing.
Awesome. Yeah. Really good advice. Really appreciate you spending time. We're gonna end things there. Really appreciate your advice, Megan. I think all of us, I learned a ton. I know the folks on the phone learned a ton. So really appreciate you taking the time. Any last parting words for the folks on the call?
Just keep talking about this and paying attention to this. I suspect in a year or two from now, this will look even different than it does today, because everyone is trying to figure this out.
Sure.
But just not to take your eye off of it, because I think in order for CS as a practice to thrive in the world that we're in, we need to get good at this. So the smarter we can all make each other, I think is really key.
Great. Well, cool. We'll pause it there. So final housekeeping stuff. For those of you who have been, as I mentioned at the beginning of the call, those of you who have been following the Client Success webinar series for a while, you'll notice this was a different format. We did much more of fireside chat, podcast type format. Love your feedback. Do you think this worked? Do you think there's something you would like us to do differently? Would love you can email me directly. You'll have my email in the follow-up email that I send out. And if you joined late, you only got in, you missed the first 10, 15 minutes, I'll send out the recording so everybody will have access to it. But I'd love your feedback. And in addition to everything that Megan mentioned here, which I will firmly stand behind, I agree with everything that was mentioned here. If you're looking for help to implement some of these strategies on the consulting side, feel free to reach out to Megan and her team at ESG. They're a great resource. They've gone through this process, dozens, if not hundreds of times with clients to help them manage this transition. And if you're to the point where you're looking for a platform, if you're looking for, a customer success software platform that's going to help you implement some of these strategies, help your team own revenue, help your team really manage this process, love for you to talk with some members of my team who's happy to help with you, because we have tons of customers who we've helped make this transition from to transition to more strategic revenue ownership aspects of the business. So Really excited. Thanks again for your time, Megan. And thanks for everybody on the call.